Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Rebecca Sachs in support of City of a Thousand Gates. First, a quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you might want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be sharing links to purchase City of a Thousand Gates from Literati. It's available for curbside pickup if you live in Ann Arbor, and of course, we also ship anywhere in the United States. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there's always a link in the description right below me to purchase books from our bookstore. If you're watching live, you can, of course, submit questions for our Q&A at the end of the conversation that Rebecca and I will have using the Q&A feature available to you either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of operating system you're working with. And I'll read a selection of those conversations at the conclusion of our conversation. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan and to have shipped to you anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our virtual events, you can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for joining us this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author. Rebecca Sachs graduated from the program in writing at the University of California, Irvine. In 2019, she received the Canada Council for the Arts grant, as well as the Joseph F. McCrindle Foundation's Henfield Prize for Fiction. She has been awarded fellowships from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Juniper Summer Writing Institute, and the Mellon Sawyer Documenting War Seminar Series. After graduating from Dartmouth College, she worked for several years at Vanity Fair before moving to Israel, where she received a master's in Jewish studies. Her dispatches from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem have been published in journals such as the Paris Review Daily. She's a citizen of Canada, the United States, and Israel. Rebecca can't hear you, but through the power of the internet, she can certainly sense it. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca Sachs into your living rooms. Rebecca, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm really excited. Thank you.
I think what we'll do first is you're going to start us off with a brief reading from the novel itself.
That's right. I'm going to read from the first chapter, although not the beginning of it. So the first chapter flips between a few different points of view. And at this point, we have just ended in the point of view of an Israeli soldier at a checkpoint, and now we are opening in a new point of view. At the crossing into Jerusalem, Samar tries to hold on to herself. She edges into the cages of checkpoint 300, single file in a line of people with permits to cross. She knows she is lucky that she did not have to travel in the morning, when the men arrive as early as 4 a.m. to cram themselves into the winding walkway of cement and bars. Even now, early afternoon, she has waited over an hour to get to the head of the line. Bodies push against Samar, everyone pushing up to the front, pushing their way to the soldiers, a mass of people constantly at risk of trampling themselves. Nearby, someone's festering sweat is giving off the overpowering smell of onions. Samar has her awiyah ready, her entry permit carefully folded. There are only 5 people ahead of her. Each person waits until the turnstile beeps green. Then you must awkwardly sidestep through the turnstile, never mind if you have a stroller, crutches, a wheelchair. In autumn, she read a brilliant article in Kipal about the nature of the turnstile at the Israeli checkpoints, how they are specifically designed to be difficult to maneuver, that what seems like a malfunction is in fact a form of tactical degradation. Samar herself has written about checkpoints, papers in Arabic, English, German. As an academic, she has read the checkpoint through a variety of theoretical lenses that, if they don't make the experience mean something, at least communicate the senselessness of her life within the Israeli system. But at the checkpoint itself, it doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter that she has a brilliant mind, that she is on her way to pick up a visa that will allow her to attend an academic conference in Chicago and present a paper there. It doesn't matter that her articles on the violence of bureaucracy, memorial, and nation states are widely cited. It doesn't matter from inside the moment what she will do later to narrativize the moment. What matters is that she breathes, that she does not panic in the cage of the checkpoint, that she does not turn around and yell at the person behind her, "Get your hands off me." Thank you.
Thank you. Um, Thank you for choosing that passage as well. As I'll get to in some of my questions, I think is a moment early on in the novel that really cements what I think is so special about it. But first, I just wanted to sort of ask you how the novel came about and how it was set in motion. You lived in Israel. You got your master's in Jewish studies while there. You were writing dispatches, as I mentioned in your bio, from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And I'm curious if there was some other path that was interrupted by what became this novel, and sort of what set it in motion.
Yes, I think for me, writing a novel was in a way almost a last resort. I I I'd been living in Israel for a number of years, and as you said, writing these sort of nonfiction
Mm-hmm.
accounts of the place I was in, and the nonfiction was really, in a sense, a way for me to explain to myself and a reader um, the landscape of the world I was living in, with a particular attention on all these boundaries, a kind of, I think I'm learning that maybe each novel has its own obsession, and without a doubt that's I think the prevailing obsession of City of a Thousand Gates is these boundaries. And but in my nonfiction, I was essentially describing them, reporting on them, um, all the ways in which the um, you are constantly having your daily routine shaped by treaty lines, ideologies, the effects of living in all kinds of different languages, and maybe different resonances that I was learning to hear in Hebrew and much later in Arabic. And I think when I began to write fiction, it was because I had reached what I felt was essentially the end of what I could do in nonfiction, with my own with my own body at the center, my
Mm-hmm.
white Jewish North American person. um, and and I felt that if I really wanted to kind of credibly convey the reality that I was in, that I really had to write it from the points of view of individuals for whom those boundaries were incredibly consequential. Palestinians in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, Israelis who live in West Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and in settlements in the West Bank. These are people whose daily lives and intimacies are shaped by political violence, not in identical symmetrical ways, but
Mm-hmm.
all in incredibly consequential ways. And so I think that's what drew me to attempt fiction. I'd never written fiction before. Of course, I'd always wanted to. I mean, who doesn't? But it was hard to get up the courage, and I think it was really when I felt like I had no other option that I I began.
So the project was to sort of just continue these what had been happening in nonfiction, but to go at something that you couldn't necessarily reach. So you sort of had reached that kind of barrier with what you're able to convey with that. So you're continuing on the whatever impetus, I guess, writing wise had led you to write those dispatches, and following that thread through to the fictional.
Right. So, for example, the first chapter, quite a bit of it, not or a good amount of it, takes place at checkpoint 300.
Right.
Samar is trying to cross through to Jerusalem. Earlier, you have a soldier, Ori, and he's quite bored and frustrated on a kind of guard duty at the checkpoint, and um, and I, for example, became aware that if I give a personal account of my own traveling through a checkpoint, it doesn't really convey the reality of that checkpoint at
Yeah.
all. Um, the way it's controlling individuals and controlling time, and none of these consequences were really applicable to me, because all the things that kind of made me a solid journalist to be reporting, that I'm so protein there and I have access to so many different spaces, um, Jewish spaces, Palestinian spaces, because I'm not really coded as anything except white and foreign there, really.
Hmm.
And that's very much to my advantage. And yet, so all the things that made me quite effective in reportage actually made me a fairly uninteresting subject, because what happens to me at a checkpoint really is almost disguises the truth of that checkpoint, and the way it's shaping the lives of both the people who operate it and the people moving through it.
And as well, to make that move to the fictional, you'll have to sort of fictionalize in some sense the conflict itself. So the novel is rooted in these two elements, these two occurrences: the murder of a 14-year-old um, Israeli girl in a settlement, and then in retaliation to that event, the brutal beating of a completely unrelated Palestinian teenager at a shopping mall, and who's sort of beaten within an inch of his life, and when the novel begins is currently in a hospital. Um, and all of this, in some sense, if one is familiar with the past 20 or so years I mean, it's obviously predates that, but it's reminiscent of some of the things that came out of the 2014 Gaza war and the violence in 2015 and 2016, which was referred to as many things, but involved um, murders of Israeli citizens and also these sort of intense retaliatory attacks on Palestinians. And to write about these experiences and to write about the conflict as such and to write about these power imbalances, you have to create things that are near to the actual conflict itself. And I'm just curious about the process of choosing like how you do that in a way that doesn't. It's tough. I mean, it seems like a daunting task to any writer to fictionalize the conflict in a way that's believable and isn't unfair. Um, and I wonder how you went about doing that. And I just want to say too the novel is very clear in that the power imbalances in this situation are not explained away. It's handled very deftly for a novel that is moving through a large cast of characters.
Uh, well, uh, I'm 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 gratified by the attention you that the that you paid to the power imbalance. That was something that was very much in my mind, and I think in general speaks to the way I imagined my obligation, which was to convey a material reality through fiction. Um, and so there is no character who's a sort of thinly veiled depiction of an actual individual, and certainly not myself. But and there's no one single event that is an almost like an artifact of an exact event as it occurred. However, I was living in Israel in the years you mentioned, and they did have a very profound impact on me. And I think a lot of the violence that I witnessed the variety of ideological murders certainly lodged themselves deep inside me. Um, and in a way, perhaps became things that I had to write out. And so, in the process, they did become fictionalized. Um, but there are moments that I can pinpoint that are depicted in the novel that I know were the are fragments of realities that I either witnessed in person or in the news, and that they stayed lodged in me and they remained preserved in the accounts. For example, there's a certain depiction of a smearing of blood in Yael's bedroom, the 14-year-old girl who is murdered in her bedroom, and that image, the smearing of this child's blood, uh, was something that was reported on, uh, in a murder that was similar but not identical while I was living in Israel. And it's not exactly like I saw that and said, okay, that has to
Right.
remain preserved. But I think in a way it did sort of lodge itself in me like a kind of splinter or a kind of wound, and a lot, maybe the work sort of radiated out of that. So too the beating of the young Palestinian teenager, Salem, um, that I went to a Palestinian refugee camp, and a young man showed me security footage of someone in his neighborhood being horribly beaten. It was horrible to watch. And that was, quite a while before I started the novel, actually. But so when it came out in the story, it wasn't that I had intended to um, recreate what I had seen, but I think what I found as I was writing, that there were certain moments of a kind of a deep horror, a deep horror that I had felt, what I was seeing was happening to these young people, and the way that they were being, it almost felt like consumed, mashed
Mm-hmm.
up by these ideological machines. And I think, I think maybe just letting myself be deeply, deeply affected, um, and letting the writing emerge from um, the most vulnerable place I could find. So I don't know if I recommend that approach. It's a little taxing, but it felt like necessary for this project.
And it comes through. I mean, it comes through in the sense that and this I guess leads me to my next question is that, you know, the these conflicts and violence surrounding the occupation is fictionalized, and there are more than a handful of recent um, English language novels that deal with the conflict. But often, and I think some reviews have commented on this too, in way of praising you. So I'm not going to say uh, uh, that there's the sort of stock way that oftentimes the conflict is received in the West, which is sort of sometimes through a glass darkly, and whether that is to the conflict is some strange setting for some sort of more broadly humanist and maybe sort of uncoupled from the material reality kind of message, which is, I'm not saying is a bad thing, but maybe would strike someone living through the reality of the region as naive or something like that. There's novels I can think of that fast forward into the future of the conflict so they can kind of avoid the recursive endlessness of what repeats in as settlements expand, and then there's violence, and then there's violence and reciprocity, and then there are reconciliations, and then there are political breakdowns, and et cetera, et cetera. So those things can be elided in fiction as well. So I'm curious about like what the fictional legacy of the conflict, how that might have weighed on this book, because I think it also dispenses with some myths we have about writing about the present historical moment. And it's very depth. It's hard to describe without, just having someone read the book. But there's an avoidance of reinscribing yourself into the novel as a in terms of your experiences that you had when you were living there, and reinscribing some of those things that we often see in American letters, that have been talked about recently too, about depiction, and about the fragility of depiction when one is writing from outside of one's experience. Sorry,
Yes.
maybe that's kind of a thorny, long overall question.
It's a very welcome line of inquiry, and something I think about a lot too. I mean, there there's a lot of not just in fiction, but in reportage, of Israel and Palestine. There's a kind of what I felt, what I've come to feel over the years is a certain narrative lie, that isn't always even explicit, but you can always sense it. And to me, the lie is of a symmetrical conflict.
Yeah.
And in a way, and there's a certainly an appealing simplicity to this, and that this is an ancient conflict rooted in a historical grievance, two peoples split from Abraham, and we haven't gotten along since, that kind of thing, and that really then, to use your word, the perfect word, I think, elides the legacies of colonialism and imperial power, and the ways in which those legacies are very present in the modern day political realities, and who has control of what. And so I think I felt very resistant to those narratives of a perfect symmetry, and the way in which that's a disservice to everyone, to Palestinians and to Israelis. I think in ways that are not identical or symmetrical, but in very real ways, almost everyone who comes from that place, let's say, often faces the risk of being treated as a symbol, a symbol for something. And there's something so fundamentally violent about that. There is a lot of talk, I know, of all different kinds of violence, physical violence, and then a kind of abstracted theoretical violence that can perhaps be hard to pin down. But the assimilation of an individual human being into a symbol, unequivocally is a horrendous violence. And when you see so much in how this conflict is reported on, in how it is talked about by people from all over the political spectrum, in the United States, and I think I felt a real sort of urgency to depict individuals and their families, and yes, to be very aware of their, as we've said, their material realities, their political realities, the options they are given, the biases they might have, of course, based on their positions in relation to the Israeli state, but that each person is an individual. And furthermore, what's most important to me about them, perhaps, or most interesting to me about them, may well not be what's most important to them about themselves. So for example, the soldier Ori, whose section immediately precedes the one I read.
Right. I was about to bring this up.
So for me, I'm very invested. Like, what is the toll taken of having this, being so young and being in this position of having to essentially control these Palestinian individuals, having to come through and fresh out of high school, essentially, and in a position of both power and essentially a kind of powerlessness, so few decisions being his own. And this is this to me is what I think about when I think about this character. He is very concerned with how his most recent Instagram post is
Right.
doing. This is like his big concern of the day, how many likes he's gotten on this photo he posted of his boots, which is a kind of like classic IDF pose, like the boots and the maybe a little bit of the weapon's muzzle. So he's thinking about that. He's like wondering if his mom is going to buy him the new iPhone. Like his concerns um, are Ori's, not mine,
Right.
and not yours, and not anyone else's, not any readers. And I think with each character, I tried to write them from very deep inside,
Yeah.
um, both reflected in what's most important to them, and even on the level of language. I studied Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and modern Hebrew, and literary Arabic, and the Palestinian colloquial Arabic. Um, and to me, it felt very important to be thinking through characters in their own languages as much as possible. I'm not a native speaker of any of these languages, so I couldn't pretend to be, but I think having having the ability to converse and read and write in these languages was so important, because I think for all of us, not just for writers, memory is a linguistic event, and we
Yeah.
think ourselves and we access ourselves through language. Once we are linguistic, once we speak, we access our inner selves through language, in dreams and therapy, whatever. And how fraudulent it would be for me to be thinking Ori in English if he's thinking himself
Mhm.
in Hebrew, or for me to be imagining Samar's, the Palestinian professor whose section I read, imagining her conversations with her ailing mother in English as opposed to in Arabic. That I don't know. I think there would be a certain fraudulence there that might be hard to pinpoint, but easy to detect. Um, and I think that was an important way that I suppose did right by these characters. At least I hope I did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think to your earlier point too about focusing on the material. It's you're right that and it's sort of not abnormal for fiction to symbolize people, um, going back to sort of our earliest traditions of fictional writing. And it's weird that there's this inversion here that you can see the power imbalance shows through, not through having these characters be avatars for whatever systems they are participating in. What's really stunning about the passage you read is exactly what you talked about, which is that preceding it, Ori is just determining whether he wants to have a granola bar or not, or if he's going to call somebody or call his mom, or all these other very quotidian things are going through his head. He's talking about jokes he has with his other people at the checkpoint, about how he hates being at the checkpoint, how he can't wait to just be out of IDF and doing whatever he's going to do with his life. And then immediately following that, Samar is experiencing the full heft of being at the checkpoint, of being surveilled, of not swatting a fly that's landed on her because it would be a sudden move, which completely is antithetical to the sort of like incredibly boring, I'm a teen at the like working at a roller coaster or something like that during the summer kind of experience that he's having. And so you see that this structure of power is far beyond these people's individual existence, and it allows, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but that rootedness in those people's material lives allows you to avoid exactly what you wanted to avoid, which is having these people be symbolized in some way. And to the other point too, actually, I'm curious to know more. This was you led to my second question. It's fascinating to know that you imagine these characters through their languages, and I'm also curious to know, um, what the research process was like beyond the things that you were able to experience firsthand, or became common to you living in Israel, and what things did you have to seek out in order to make sure you're doing, as you say, right by these characters' experiences.
Yes. So aside from formally studying the languages of the region, let's say, um, which I in part was able to do because I was, doing graduate work in Jewish studies. I thought that I would go on to a PhD, probably in Torah, and so that gave me access to like so many resources. It's so and through Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, and later the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. So that I and actually I was able to continue studying Arabic at UC Irvine. When I got into the MFA, that was one of my sort of uh, demands. That's too strong a word, perhaps, but I had these funny conversations with Michelle Atile, who's the head of the program and now a friend, but saying, okay, but can I keep studying Arabic? And she said, well, let me check, but I'm sure you can. No, just hold on. So I really did have to make it a priority. But aside from that, definitely many different sources of um, of research and get it coming in close contact with the material, and incredible generosity from Palestinian and Israeli families. The Everything you've heard about the hospitality in the region is true.
Right.
So you will be mercilessly fed, and yeah, it's really something, and welcomed into homes, and I think I was so lucky that I was invited into so many homes and really got to be part of the sort of rhythms of daily life, domestic life, the concerns. And I saw that both in a variety of Israeli homes, friends who I made, some through school, some sort of incidentally. One of my closest friends, her family lives on a kibbutz, and I spent a lot of time there. I met her because we were flatmates. I found a listing on Facebook, so just sort of like that, and so too in the homes of Palestinians. Although that said, I had much less incidental sort of contact with Palestinians, especially West Bank Palestinians, and it was really very lucky that a tour guide I had very early on, he a wonderful generous person named Caesar, and if anyone needs a West Bank tour guide, I've got you. But at a time of great violence, actually this was just before the 2014 invasion of Gaza, and it was Ramadan, and a young man named Muhammad Abu Khdir had been horribly murdered, and I felt like a kind of urgency. It was Ramadan, and I realized I'd never even had the iftar meal, the breaking of the fast. Like I was living in Israel. I'd been such a secular, fairly disconnected Jew before that, and I was becoming more and more ingrained in these beautiful, fulfilling ways in the rhythms of Jewish life. And yet I realized almost zero experience with any kind of Muslim holiday or Palestinian life more generally from Muslim or Christian Palestinian homes. And so I wrote to one of the few contacts I had, who was this perfectly nice tour guide. And I said, do you know of any mosques that might have an open iftar meal? And he wrote back, said, I have no idea what you're talking about, but please come to my home and just come on by. So I went into the West Bank city of Bethlehem for the first time alone, eat dinner with his family, became very close to his daughter, who's the same age as me, has a very different life, but a very similar sensibility. And I just kept going, and they just kept inviting me, and it went from this kind of like formal, fairly formal request to something incredibly familiar and easy. Why don't you come by this weekend? Like it'll be nice. I have a little time off work. Come say hi, kind of thing. Or so, and yet also one through spending time with that family, again feeling the rhythms of their life, and learning all the kind of less visible and obvious but really impactful ways that their lives are controlled by living under military occupation, in ways that maybe I wouldn't have, I think I wouldn't have been able to imagine.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a human being, and I'm limited in my empathetic imagination. It's not total, and so I think spending time with this family and just understanding, like, oh, you have to be really careful about how long your shower is because water is so limited. Uh, and Yeah, so I think I really was loved and welcomed, and that shaped me and shaped my ability to write this book. And the last part, it is getting to be quite a long answer, is that
No, no, no.
I read a lot, not
Mhm.
many, I have to admit, American writers about 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 the but a lot of Israeli and Palestinian writers, whose whose work absolutely shaped me, and I
Mhm.
did try in the acknowledgments of the book to give a kind of, essentially, like a reading list,
Yeah.
but I'm sure I missed works, films, and books, but mostly books that really shaped me. But you and I were talking before we started about Adania Shibli, who's
Mhm.
a Palestinian writer whose work is, I mean, one, an account of the kind of fracturing of the fracturing that happens when you live under the kind of pressure she lives in. But I would say also just some of the craft decisions she makes, the way she splits narratives are just cool and exciting. Reading a fair amount of Amos Oz and Edgar Carrot, Eshkol Nevo. So really, I think listening, I guess what I'm describing actually
Yeah.
in a lot of different examples is listening, learning language so I could listen, being invited into homes and listening, reading as a kind of listening. There was a lot of listening before I began to talk.
Well, and when you began to talk, there's this symphony. There are 20 plus characters in the novel. In fact, at the beginning, you'll see a cast of characters in the first few pages. And it shouldn't be daunting to a reader, because as soon as you dive in, you meet almost all of them in the first chapter, more or less. And then you just feel like you are there with them, and they're also crisscrossing literally in front of each other's faces in those first 20 pages as well. And that's one of the really, from a craft standpoint, truly impressive things about the novel is this cast of characters and how they're all believably right next to each other, but 6 degrees of separation still. And I read an interview with you. You mentioned that your process involved a lot of off screen writing. And so, in order to get all this stuff, it's just structurally, um, not you have all this research. We've talked about characterization and how you approach that, but to assemble the actual nuts and bolts of the novel. You mentioned in this interview that you're doing some writing longhand outside of your computer, and also a pretty uh, inventive structural conceit as well, that I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about.
Pleasure. Yeah, I've been very gratified by the interest in my idiosyncratic system. I just wrote an essay for LitHub on this too.
Oh,
So
cool. Great.
if you really want
I
to
will
know,
keep an eye out for it. I'm very intrigued.
yes, if you're really intrigued by my own private machinations, well, yes. So I did. I, I would say in general, anyone who is working on a writing project, like, it's great to let the process get kind of idiosyncratic, like let it get creative, figure out what you want to address in your own writing, and almost, if possible, have some fun addressing it. There's a lot of emphasis, I think, put on the sort of the labor of writing, and it is difficult. It's intense, taxing work, but I don't think you're any less of a writer if you enjoy doing it. If you can find pleasure in it. I don't think that makes your work less serious. Um, and so, with that in mind, I've tactically positioned my camera so you cannot see it. But this room is sort of covered in this funny little web of clothesline, and I have these mini clothespins. And what I do is I use these both in my composition and my editing. So my composition, I tend to rush my tellings a little. I get excited. I want to get there. I want to get the characters to the checkpoint, or I want to get them in bed together, or I want to whatever. I want to get to the place where the things are going to happen, and I can rush a little. So what I do in in a first draft is, or at least in this novel, I think it'll probably. I hope my process changes with every novel. I think that would be fun. But with this novel, I started by writing essentially every sentence on um, these little note cards. They're thin and affordable, but they're elegant, which is important to me. And every sentence. So this is from I pulled these. This is from a Vera story. Vera is a German journalist, real distinct voice, caustic character. But anyway, so each sentence is written on a note card, which or a piece of paper like this, and then I clip these up. And then I can stand back and look at it and ask myself, okay, where did I maybe skip over sentences? Where did I get so excited that I skipped over a sentence? A whole paragraph, maybe, a scene. Did I write a sentence in summary, but that really wants to be a scene? And so the first edit is sort of looking at all these little bits of paper on my clotheslines and looking for places where I can write in, where I can go deeper, essentially. So that maybe a chapter that wants to be 30 pages will start at like 12, something like that. So that's for composition, that's how that happens. And it really helps to see it up on the wall, because I need to sort of move these sentences and write something and put it in and see what it looks like. And it feels good to make it physical, like to write it down and to stand up and to walk over and clip it up. It feels good to break out of the screen and to be physically engaging with my work, to letting myself get really physically inside it, actually is, I think, affects the writing and qualities of the writing in ways that are perhaps borderline mystical. But and then when I edit it, it's something similar. So I'll ultimately type it up, the draft, and I'll have a typed up draft. I'll print it out. I'm like in a domestic partnership with my printer. I love my printer so much. It's just my whole life.
You have one that works.
I have one that works
reliably.
Letting it go.
That's miraculous.
Yeah, it really is. We're a team, she and I. But so I'll print it out, and then I'll cut out each paragraph, pin each paragraph up. Wow. And begin to sort of look for different strands. Maybe each story will have different strands, okay, in this story, Vera, who I just mentioned, maybe is thinking about her mother and memories about her mother's indignity in her marriage. But she's also drinking quite a bit. So those are two different strands, and they're each going to get a different color. I'm going to keep track of the mother in pink. Anytime the mother shows up, pink highlighter. I'm going to keep track of her drinking in orange. Also, she's waiting for a text from a young man who is what we would call, can I swear?
Yes, absolutely.
In the parlance of the day, a fuckboy. And, and he's not texting her back, and she's waiting for this text. And so maybe, and this is triggering a lot of self-loathing in her, that she's so obsessed with this person who doesn't even like her. And this is going to happen in blue. So every time I sense that strand, I'm going to highlight it in blue. And then one of the things I look for is, how balanced are these strands? Is one getting more weight than the other? Do I want that? And when do they come in? I mean, it's not, unless you have a really good reason, I don't want, let's say, a new element in a story or a chapter to come in after like the first fourth. Like if everything's not in motion in the first fourth of the story, Like, unless you're George Saunders, I'm not sure you can make it work. Like, like for that he's like his own thing. It's like, yeah, and then in the last half there's ghosts. We love it.
Yeah.
Great. But I don't. That's beyond my own abilities. Like, I tend to need quite a bit of control, and maybe because this is my first novel, so almost like a borderline kind of formula that I had in my
Yeah.
mind, in terms of, you're going to get everything into motion by this point in the
Yeah.
chapter. So this gave me a way to really visualize it, and I could sort of see and apprehend and respond to so much more than I would have been able to keep track of just in my head, looking at it, in sentences scrolling by on my screen. So yeah, I would say for anyone, just you know try things out, see, try it out, and see what works. But it can be sort of like physical and playful, and that doesn't mean that your work's not, like, serious.
That's, I mean, it was just really cool to hear about. Thank you for explaining it further. I think one of the more useful things I came away from an MFA program with was thinking about poetry collections as collections, and it's like physically putting the things that you're going to put in a collection on the floor, and think about
uh,
how are they related to each other and stuff like
uh,
that. And I
and
think
they go
I've
on the floor, like, so you sort of walk around them from above.
Yeah, yes, yeah, and sort of think about like just putting them spatially outside of the computer. And it's something I've forgotten too, is it's very easy to start to get narrowed back in again to like, well, I have all these Google Docs, and I'm gonna Google software that organizes my Google Docs or something like that, instead of
Yeah.
just remembering that you can just print that stuff out. You
Yes.
can have that back again.
And you're right. And then also not getting pulled in. I mean, we all have like a kind of addiction to perfecting sentences. Uh, so it's maybe that's, I hadn't thought of it, but maybe that's part of too what I'm trying to circumvent in myself is I don't want to get pulled into, like, essentially line editing at some points. I want to be looking at the chapter
Yeah.
in a way that has more to do with rhythms and movements, as opposed to looking at kind of individual brushstrokes. And I think when I get on the computer, it's hard to work on a level other than the level of the sentence.
And you start to re-edit a lot, I think, when you're writing. You start the
Absolutely.
editing process immediately, and it sounds like this you can sort of stop it and
Yeah.
think more macro
Yes.
level. Yeah.
Exactly. As long as you can keep that internal editor at
Yeah.
bay, whatever you have
It's
to do
hard.
to distract her. Yeah.
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 I do want to get to audience questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to submit them. I did have one last question. I'm hoping I can sneak in greedily. Um, but it's just to sort of come full circle here. You're reading, um, you read the really beautiful passage in the first chapter with Professor Samar Farah, approaching this checkpoint. Um, and I'll quote it again. But at the checkpoint itself, she studies checkpoints. She writes about this stuff, her scholarly work. She's going to Chicago. She's working to get her visa, complicated series of bureaucracies to even be able to go give this academic talk. And she's thinking in her head, quote, but at the checkpoint itself, it doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter from inside the moment what she will do later to narrativize the moment. And I am, as a reader, definitely a knitted glutton for the metafictional gesture, and seek it out to my own detriment in what I read. But I mean, that was the moment for me that I so deeply trusted, more than I already did, how the novel would continue and what it would be examining. And you do mention in an interview, uh, as well, that you didn't want to make any. You said, "quote I don't want to make any character an outlet for my own self criticism, but I think I did want to provide a mechanism for the characters in the book to resist me." Um, and the thing that strikes me about that moment with Samar is that it's both an interrogation of the another quotidian absurdity of the checkpoint and of life as it having your movements surveilled, and yet it's also an interrogation, not of saying you personally, but it's an interrogation of the author, capital A author, let's say. It's an interrogation of, the drive to narrativize these moments. And that happens sort of like in a wide lens with other characters as well. Again, as you mentioned, not saying that these characters symbolize these things, but Vera, who's a German journalist who becomes very important in the story, is at times an avatar for this, as she sort of has these good intentions and then drifts towards making herself the center of the things she's documenting. Emily, as an American expat, who's a figure in the character as well, comes from this sort of general liberal background, American liberalism, let's say, politics, and then that sort of fades a bit, and she has to sort of cast certain allegiances. And so I'm just curious about that. Like to me, the novel came across as this really fascinating look, not just at the materiality, which you so expertly depicted, as you said at the outset of our conversation, is the idea of this was to get beyond what you couldn't get from self-reportage in the region. And it does that, but it also has this sense of making us as readers question how we receive these narratives, how things are narrativized, the divide between artistic depiction of something as deep and nuanced as the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and the conflict itself. There's this question about which is the map and which is the territory. And I'm just curious for you as an author, like that's what I took away. And I'm wondering if you're hoping that readers take away something similar, not just about the conflict, but about and the occupation, but about literatures about it as well.
Yeah, I think that whenever I found myself getting too comfortable, I'm always trying to sort of destabilize a moment, destabilize a dynamic, destabilize a character. So whenever I started maybe to get too comfortable, I suppose, in my role or in the sort of narrative mechanisms of the novel, I think I always wanted to find a way to kind of problematize and subvert,
Yeah.
which is a kind of a constant process, I think. And I think for the goal of keeping myself on my toes, and also for always finding ways to I think maybe implicate a reader in
Yeah.
you always want to find subtle ways to kind of enlist a reader. A less maybe a more obvious way is if you depict violence in a way that doesn't comment on the violence, so whoever's seeing it isn't horrified, the prose isn't horrified, it's not a bunch of frantic run-on sentences that seem to sort of like respond to and express the horror of the violence, but are actually fairly straightforward declarative sentences about something something horrific, then the reader is enlisted a little to respond. The prose isn't providing an emotional response. The reader is enlisted, and the reader is a little implicated, and is forced to maybe even do a little work. This is an old trick, really, nothing new. But I think in different ways that I think that what you're describing, which is that in some ways the way in which we narrativize the conflict, as we call it, the way that is sort of like called into question and becomes a source of discomfort, I think reflects my the way that I think consistently sort of writing into my own discomfort, my own blind spots, as much as I interrogate those of my characters. What won't they let themselves know about themselves? I think I too am letting that question guide the decisions that I make about where to take the novel, what to expose, what to call into question. So, but it's. But it's it's ongoing, and I think that sort of problematization will continue, even though my my work with it essentially is done. As now, it'll exist in a conversation related to a larger discussion about about Israel and Palestine in American letters, about white people writing characters who are people of color. Like
Yeah.
So now this, I think the process continues. My job is once again to listen, I would say, but yeah, so ongoing, an ongoing
Well,
monetization. Yeah.
thank you. I mean, yeah, I appreciate that answer, and I certainly do hope that readers continue to reach for works that sometimes discomfit them. Weird
Mm.
time to ask for that, maybe, perhaps, but we will continue to be made uncomfortable in our lives, and so hewing closer to it sometimes is important, and it's also just such a beautiful and human book too. Not to say that it's going to startle and overly discomfort people as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you find if you spend a region where there is a lot of violence is people are so fierce in their joys.
Yeah,
Celebration of religious holidays, of family, tradition, domestic life, um, marital bliss. That
yeah.
there's a real insistence on these kind of joys and pleasures, and I try to reflect that as well, and yeah.
Yes, there are flawed and flourishing human beings in
Mm.
this book. Uh, there's just a couple questions. Someone wanted to know if there was, if you ever opened a window while these pieces were clipped up and they all flew away.
You
If
know,
there's,
so I so they're clipped pretty well. What does happen sometimes is I'll open the window and they'll all begin to like tremble. Um and that it almost feels like they're scolding me, like you haven't done enough with us. Saying I'm trying.
and then there's just one more question. Curious about the process of writing. Did you start writing in Israel or when you came back? If it was there, were you keeping a journal? Coloring the book with stuff you experienced firsthand? How did the initial assemblage, I guess, begin?
Hmm, it's funny that thinking about the geography of the there and back. Where's the but
Yeah.
so well, I will say I've always kept a journal. I've been a journaler my whole life. I was recently rereading journals. For no real reason. It's just hard to write your second book. So I was rereading journals, and when I was like 7, and there's some elementary school rivalry that I was detailing. So I think it's good. It's good to keep a journal, in part because yeah, you're always collecting material, but maybe more importantly, you're becoming acquainted with your own voice. You're
Yeah.
developing a voice. You're finding your internal music, if it's not too much to say. So um, but I would say that I really began writing the novel in earnest when I moved to California to pursue my MFA. And before that is a good question. Like sometimes it was hard to find the kind of psychic space. A lot of times I was very much inside these sort of intense moments that I was living. When I was in Israel and
Mm-hmm.
in Palestine. And um, so I think that the most intense writing, the most focused, intense writing happened in California here while I was doing my MFA. But I was always writing throughout, um, and always journaling. Uh, yeah,
Well, Rebecca Sachs, thank you so much for joining
it's a
us
pleasure.
tonight on I Home with Literati, and congrats on all the success of the book. And wishing you continued success. And we hope we can have you in the store for your second book, of course, when it's safe to do so. And to all our attendees, thank you so much for joining us as well. We hope you're continuing to stay safe and be well. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. And of course, one last reminder that you can buy City of a Thousand Gates from Literati Bookstore. There's a link in the chat. There's also a link in the description below me if you are watching later on YouTube. Rebecca, thank you again. And
Thank you,
have a
John.
great
It was,
night.
it
Yeah.
was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care of everyone. Have a great night. Bye now.